like to give a big thanks to the organisers for the invitation to speak. Now, I've always been a big fan of Hayek, right from the word go. And I've been a especially big fan of his Denationalisation of Money, which I always thought was his best piece. Now, I came across it as a grad student at Western University in Canada in the early 1980s. It was immediately obvious to me that Hayek was right, and that the supply of money is best provided by the market. It just seemed obvious. So when I next went back to London, Ontario, I put this to my PhD supervisor, David Laidler, who many of you will know. And I said to him, very modestly, as one does, I've discovered what you monetarists have got wrong, I said. And he said, what's that? And I said, monetarists want to tell the monopolist what to do, but surely they shouldn't be a monopolist in the first place. And as far as I was concerned, that was checkmate. And he came back and he said, it's just a monopoly of the monetary base. And he said, now be a good boy and finish your thesis. Now, it was obvious to me that Hayek didn't get it. That response has rung through my mind in the last 40 odd years. He just didn't get it, he never did. Now going to Hayek, so Hayek's Choice in Currency and its more radical sequel, The Denationalisation of Money, were published in 1976. Now these can be seen as the culmination of a life's work on the evils of state money. To me, that's the key point. As he writes, he says, it is not an exaggeration to say that history is largely a history of inflation. He said, and usually of inflations engineered by governments for the gain of governments. And I think that's spot on accurate. You can't say every inflation was driven by this, but that is the normal pattern. So his message is in essence that it would be odd, to use one word, to look at the cause of monetary instability as the solution for it. It just doesn't make sense. And he says, the past instability of the market economy is the consequence of the exclusion of the most important regulator of the market mechanism, money itself, from being regulated by the market mechanism. So we should bring money under the control of the market. And just as an aside, there are three pillars of the state. We have money, we have law, and we have enforcement of law. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, that's one pillar knocked down. We just need to knock out the other two, and we've established the case for anarchy. I think that's true, but I wish it was easier to implement than that. Anyway, my point is that Hayek's point is extremely profound. He says he's saying that monetary instability can only be cured by subjecting money itself to the discipline of the market. And that is to say that the government's monetary monopoly privileges over the issue of money need to be abolished, and the issue of money needs to be opened up to the market. Now, the potential upside here is enormous. Hayek suggests that private money can bring about a monetary system that will not only cure inflation, but will produce a better outcome than the gold standard. So we're not trying to equal the gold standard, we're trying to beat it. And I agree entirely with this. And I've been searching for that better outcome since my 20s, which was a good few years ago. And I think I have the key to it. The key is an obscure 1892 article by a one-time Liberal MP called Aneurin Williams. And I forget where he was an MP for, but anyway. And it was called A Fixed Value of Bullion Standard, 1892 Economic Journal. The same issue that has Menger's famous paper on the evolution of money. So I've been working on and off on this project for decades, like I'm in the 5th decade to be precise, and I have some promising simulation results that suggest that his scheme is workable. But I really need to write these up before I drop dead, which if I carry on like this will happen. But anyway, let's leave that aside for now, but I think that there is a solution to this problem. Now, to implement privatization of money, obviously there are big obstacles to be overcome. And first off, Hayek worries, and in my opinion rightly, that free banking may only be possible under a limited government such that we do not yet have. Now that's a key point. We just haven't got the government under sufficient control. So this raises the difficult issue of political feasibility. Or to put it in more modern terms, how do we bring free banking within the bounds of the Overton window? Well, I would love somebody to tackle this problem because I've dismally failed. How to make it politically realistic? And all I can say on this is that perhaps a future financial crisis may make it possible, where every option has been exhausted, but something like this. We should never let a good crisis go to waste, but we should always be ready on the off chance. We saw this in the post-Soviet period where radical reforms could be implemented, but people had to be ready for them. The right man in the right, or the right woman in the right place. So there's also the problem of what's missing from Hayek. And this would include more details on how the implementation of denationalisation. And one mentioned Vera Smith's book. Now, Smith's book was written under his auspices at the LSE in 1936, and it gives a remarkably modern assessment of free banking as we might write it ourselves. It really is astonishingly modern. And I was puzzled why Hayek didn't really go further into the details of that, because it would have answered some of the gaps that he left in his work. Still, to address this issue, we need to move from the political economy of free banking to its financial engineering. Okay, so there's often a sense that Hayek writes as if he's thinking of going from the current central banking system to one of competing issuers of fiat money. And that's certainly the way many modern writers have interpreted him. Whereas, if he'd actually possibly gone into more detail on Vera Smith's book, that's not the case. We don't have competing fiat issuers. We have central banks on commodity standards, on free banks on commodity standards. So I think that is an important misconception about Hayek, which has unfortunately bedeviled his work ever since. So what I see in this is a free banking system of competing banks of issue operating on a commodity standard, which could be a gold standard, but doesn't have to be a gold standard. So imagine the following. So imagine that we go back to 1819 in this country, to the Gold Standard Resumption Act, which essentially re-established the pound as a lump of gold of certain troy fineness. And a pound note was merely a receipt to a pound, which was this lump of gold. So that's our starting point. So pound notes are receipts. The issuer of the note has to redeem the receipt on demand or face default. So now it's important to understand how this system works. And I'd like to emphasize 2 points. The first is that banks can issue as many notes as they want. It doesn't matter how many notes they issue. What matters is that if the public don't hold them, the notes will come back to the bank for redemption. So there's no point over issuing notes because you have to have the gold ready to redeem on demand. So this is the law of reflux. So excess note issues come back automatically to the bank of issue, which must redeem. And that is the discipline on the note issue. Now, the second constraint facing free banks is much less well discussed, but it's really rather simple. If banks run down their capital, they will lose the confidence of their customers, and they face the danger then that they get run out of business. So implicit in this is some sort of capital constraint that basically says, if I go too far, if I take wild risks, I run down my capital ratios, or overdo my leverage ratio, then you face potential consequences down the road. And so the implication is that competition between the banks will ensure that the banks remain strong, and they will be as strong as the customers demand. So this is a second constraint. It's entirely a market constraint. There's no legal requirement, no legal capital ratios, no legal note issue ratios, or anything like that. So since customers demand strong banks to keep their money safe, then banks will be strong. And just give you an example. When federal deposit insurance was introduced in the United States around 1940, it led to a halving of the capital ratios of American banks, because they were reliant on deposit insurance to reassure the customers instead of relying on their own capital strength. So basically, that's how the free banking system works. Now, the next question is, how do we get from here to there? So, again, going back to the early 19th century England, of course, I don't mention Scotland because Scotland already had free banking and it was working very well, thank you very much. It was only in England. We could get rid of the Bank of England's note issue privileges and various other dodgy deals. The consequences of dodgy deals have been made in back doors with governments that were impecunious but had the legislative power and so forth. So the bankers and the government were in cahoots, really. And that's how we got the Bank of England to be what Adam Smith described in The Wealth of Nations as the great engine of state, although I wouldn't describe it in such glowing terms. All we need to do is get rid of the bank's privileges, and bear in mind that the bank was a private institution then. And then effectively we have free banking. I mean, you'd have to tweak the way the money markets work and stuff like that, but that's not a big deal. The bank would be an ordinary bank, just like the others, or you could get rid of it if you wish. Either would work. So, several times in the early 19th century, this nearly happened. I can think of two occasions. One of them was at the height of the 1825 crisis, which was the biggest crisis in England before 2007, 2008, in which it was said that England came within 24 hours of barter. You know, that there was a massive run on the banking system. It was triggered, not triggered, but underlying it was a loose monetary policy over the previous few years. And eventually it all came crashing down. And in amongst the panic over the bank, and many people don't know this, the bank almost got abolished. There was a group of cabinet ministers led by Peel, Huskisson, and several others who were pushing strongly, let the bank fail. Who cares? And then, unfortunately, Wellington then decided to get involved. And he said, look, guys, even if this is the right solution, now's not the time to do it. And that Wellington's intervention saved the bank. So you might say it was a close-run thing. Okay. A few years later, the Bank of England's charter was due to be renewed in 1833. So remember that the bank's charter was like 25 years, I think was the typical length. And the government kept the bank on a leash because the bank had to come and beg for the renewal of its charter. And, well, we'll give you a renewal, but, you know, you'll have to give us a cheap loan or something like this. The bank was actually informed by the government that they couldn't get the support and that the charter would expire. But then there was some fancy footwork, you know, behind closed doors, and lo and behold, the charter was renewed and the bank lived to fight another day. So Now, there's no doubt, therefore, of the basic question that a free banking system would work. We know that from this experience, from Scotland, from many other experiences. So we know this because systems of free banking on commodity standards, which might be gold, and typically in the English-speaking countries it was gold, in the non-English-speaking countries it was silver or bimetallism. These systems worked exceptionally well. So we had successful free banking for a long period of time in Scotland. We had it in Canada. We had successful free banking in parts of the United States in the generation before the Civil War. And we had it in many other countries too. And these case studies of successful free banking are set out in the book that Juan kindly mentioned, The Experience of Free Banking. These case studies included, obviously, Australia, well, leaving aside the three I've mentioned, Australia, Belgium, Chile, Colombia, France, Ireland, Italy, Peru, Sweden, Switzerland, and two cases in China, and I know that there are more, as well as the three I mentioned. And I could have added Hong Kong and New Zealand to the list, but I kind of ran out of time to do it. So in the third edition, I would have those countries and as many others as I could find. Overall, there were about 60 cases, no, at least 60 cases. I suspect that there were many more. It just requires the kind of archival work to be done, preferably by people who are native speakers of the various languages that were spoken. Now, why does it work? Okay, so the answer is that bank money is a private good. It's as simple as that. So with a private good, technically it means it's non-rival, it's rivalrous in consumption. So if I consume it, you can't. And it's excludable in supply. So when I supply it, I can prevent other people from using it. These features make it a private good. And of course, with private good, we all know that markets work. So there are no externalities, there's no market failure, there's no public good features other than the unit of account itself, but not the medium of exchange. That is a private good. So all free banking systems were successful in their own terms. That they operated well when you compare those systems with what succeeded, there's no question which was better. But all eventually succumbed to governments who preyed on them for fiscal reasons. And this is in country after country after country. Eventually they replaced free banking systems with central banking systems that did not work nearly as well. There was much more instability, financial instability, and God knows how much inflation. Because with the fiat money, there is no control over the money supply except that deemed appropriate by the central bank itself, which could be anything. So among banking systems, you have a form of Gresham's law, which operated by which the bad systems drive out the good. But this is not some economically rational Gresham's law, it's purely a political process. So it's driven by that. Now, going to modern Britain, for example, the re-establishment of free banking would be more involved. Oh, you can imagine why. We have to deal with the bank's regulatory role, which is much more serious than what it was to the extent it existed at all in the 19th century. And we have to bear in mind that the bank's regulatory role, which is to support the banks, has made them massively weaker. Massively weaker. And this we saw in the great financial crisis, where the total losses in bank capital, and very few people know this, are about £500 billion. So it wiped out the bank's capital 2 or 3 times. I once spoke to the Bank of England's financial stability guy, and he said to me, "Oh, we really must calculate that figure sometime," is what he said to me. And I said, "Yes, I think that would be a good idea. This is the number." But of course, they don't want to publish an idea like that because it showed you how capital inadequate the banking system was going into the great financial crisis, having told us it was anything but capital inadequate. It was just a minor liquidity problem, they said. So anyway, so we have to deal with this problem. So the bank's regulatory role has to be abolished. We need to get to a system in which regulation comes from the market. Well, now we can either abolish regulation outright, as Javier Milei might do, or give it notice it will be phased out. In the latter case, we say to the weak banks, either get your capital in shape or we will release market forces and you'll be driven out of business. So financial regulation would then be gone except regulation by the market, which is the only regulation you want. Now, we could go further, and I would suggest we should. In countries with written constitutions, we want some form of free money amendment. So obviously the United States would be the ideal. The idea is to make it as difficult as possible for the government to prey on the banking system in the future. We can't stop it doing that, but we can shove every obstacle in their way that we can think of. So we have the guys with the guns, the government, we have the guys with the money, which is the bankers. We need to keep them separate as much as possible. That's the key from a political economy point of view. Now, this is exceptionally difficult to do because they have a natural incentive to collude with each other. The government wants cheap loans and the bankers want privileges which only the government can provide. So you see the problem. But at the very least, I would say we should seek to go back to the future with some fiscal constitution like they had in the past, like we had in this country, even an informal one, which said things like, it's not a good idea to run government debt. We need to have some constraints on the unrestrained issue of government debt, because eventually it undermines the monetary system, it undermines the banks, it undermines the currency, and so forth. So basically, we want to go back to the old idea that profligate government spending should be frowned upon. So if the government wants if the government wants resources, it can raise them in tax. That's what taxation is for. It should not look for dubious backseat deals. Stronger public finances also mean that there's less pressure on the government to look for funds. This is also be welcome. And bear in mind that historically there's been a number one cause of governments getting into these sorts of fiscal problems, and that is because they sought to finance wars that the public didn't want to pay for. That's always been the case. So we have to somehow support the public side of this. So what I would say is that this is welcome for its own sake too. And Hayek was in favor of this, of course. So now, I would also say that private money has worked in modern times as well. So an example is eGold. Now, eGold was founded in 1996 by Doug Jackson, who's an American. He was an oncologist with a passion for Austrian economics. And he envisaged it as a private international gold standard. And he registered it in Nevis in the Caribbean. And by 2005, so 9 years in, it was second to PayPal in the scale of payment. So it's a private gold standard. And he also worked closely with law enforcement. And he brought in some big catches because he was able, as the manager of the system, to work out from the patterns of transactions which ones were money laundering and other various things, and which were clean. And so he reported them to the police, and they got some big catches from this. So what did the US Secret Service do? They shut him down. So one day, Secret Service at the door closed everything down, arrested him and pressured him to accept a felony conviction to avoid jail time. And to me, that was a massive own goal for the law enforcement, and a really very strong testimony to the power of private money. And my understanding is that Jackson got caught up in some internal US Secret Service turf war that only a government agency could produce. And as you know, the US Secret Service has been in trouble again the last few days. So anyway, then there was the Liberty Dollar. And this was and I've forgotten to go through all of my things. Sorry. I just, completely forgot. There's that. This is the Liberty Dollar. The guy in the middle is Bernard von Nothaus, who is the monetary architect of this. Now, this was founded in 1988 to provide what he called a private voluntary barter currency. And the term barter was important because he was not labeled, although it was currency as we know it, he didn't want to advertise it as such because he'd run into legal problems. So there's a nice picture of me and Larry White at Cato a few years ago. This currency existed in specie form, paper form, and digital form. So it was, the whole works really. And it rose to become the second most popular currency in the United States after the US dollar. And people loved it. It had a really neat feature too, by which coins were periodically revalued, so that the gold content of you every now and then you could come to the mint, hand in your coin, he'd give you another coin with greater gold content, so that the Liberty dollar kept its value against gold while the US dollar depreciated, which I thought was a wonderful feature. And if you see here, these are some examples of them from 2016. They're beautifully minted coins. So I met him. I got a few when I met him. But I like this one, Trump the government. Anyway, so then all of this is going down really well. In 2006, the US Mint got involved, and they declared that the use of the Liberty dollar for currency purposes was a federal crime. Never mind that that's what the public wanted, and that the public preferred it to the greenback. And in fact, they accused him of counterfeit. So I mean, this is some counterfeit operation where he's taking paper and he's counterfeiting it with gold and silver, and making a profit from doing it. This was a remarkable feature. So he was a crap minter, but he was a crap counterfeiter, but a damn good minter. Anyway, he was put on trial. He was convicted of a number of crimes, including counterfeit, despite the fact that none of his coins looked anything like a US dollar in any version. So in the aftermath of the verdict, the US district attorney who prosecuted him, she made a series of claims that were so absurd that they've become legendary. And one of them, and she got roasted on social media, she said, "Attempts to undermine the legitimate currency of this country are a unique form of terrorism." Yeah. Now this was a guy who was a 60s surfer. He was a hippie. He wouldn't hurt a fly, and he's accused of terrorism and undermining the legitimate currency. So given Bernard's commitment to non-violence and the Fed's own inflation record, this claim must rank as one of the dumbest statements in the history of American jurisprudence. So riddle me this, Uncle Sam. If undermining the legitimate currency, you can see where I'm going, is a crime, why isn't the Fed in jail? Now, the Fed has lost over 96% of its value since the dollar has lost over 96% of its value since 1913 when the Fed started up. So Bernard was quoted by the New York Times. He said, "This is the United States government," he said. "It has nuclear weapons and it's worried about some ex-surfer guy making his own money." And then he said, "Give us a break." Anyway, both the e-gold and Liberty dollar were highly successful operations until Uncle Sam shut them down, and for no good reason at all. And we have more, in terms of private money or something close to private money, let me make a mention of currency wars, which periodically appear and have been implemented in the last few years with very successful results. these are not entirely private money, but they have many of the same features. So never forget currency bonds. So these have, like free banking, very successful track record. Lastly, let me mention cryptocurrency. This usually upsets somebody or other, and I've had a fair bit of complaints about my views on cryptocurrency. So let me just outline what I think. On the plus side, cryptos resist regulation and have proven to be very helpful to people who are trying to escape from forms of local repression, currency controls and stuff like this. So if you're in China, you're going to get your money out the country, name it, most of the countries of the world. Been very successful, and this is greatly to be welcomed, I think. But on the negative, so I worry that Bitcoin has the hallmarks of a huge speculative bubble, but there's nothing to hold the value. I worry about the dangers posed to its business model by centralizing tendencies within the mining industry. So originally, when Bitcoin came along, it was, you have to think of it as a atomistic competition, and it all looked just fine, except the atomistic competition soon grew into oligopolistic, and there's nothing to stop a monopoly emerging. I'm surprised it hasn't already. I worry that it has no stabilizing mechanism to moderate its price change. I worry about its inefficiency as a payment system. So its fees are uncertain, and transactions can take a long and certainly uncertain time to complete. Whereas if I go in there and I put a credit card down, the transaction's instantaneously done, and I know what I'm paying for the transaction. So Bitcoin cannot compete on those two things. And that's one of the reasons why, although you can use Bitcoin as money, it's never really taken off as money. So the question of what is it then? I would say, and this is a very sensitive topic, that it's more like it's not a medium, it's not really a medium of exchange except at the margin, but it's mainly an investment medium. And I would compare it, this is what really upsets the Bitcoiners, to a non-fungible token. You see, those things are ridiculous, but Bitcoin isn't a million miles away from that. And that's where the debate needs to go about this. So I worry about the extent to which Bitcoin should even be regarded as money at all. I'm choosing my words carefully, as a medium of exchange, as opposed to an NFT or something like that. So it's not so much a currency, although it is a currency, but a vehicle of speculation. Now, among cryptos, we also have stable coins, and these are essentially, these can be pegged to the US dollar, to gold, any asset, and so forth. These are free of many of the problems with Bitcoin, and they've already a significant part of, say, the US monetary system. I mean, there's hundreds of billions of US dollar stable coins, which are essentially like private notes, like private dollar notes. So that tells you that they are serving some usefulness, which we shouldn't overlook. Anyway, but it's impossible for a stable coin to be better than the asset to which it's pegged, as such. So I don't see cryptos as some kind of wonder weapon for advocates of private money. I think we have to acknowledge that they're there. We have to put them in their relevant place, and that can be debated over. So I see private money as coming from banks, maybe private payment providers. I see it often in terms of a commodity-based standard, not necessarily a gold standard. In my ideal system, the Williams system, it would be something where the amount of gold in the dollar would be periodically changed, ever so slightly, to tweak it in a way that promotes its longer term value. How we do that is a big issue. Now, last thing. So I think I've established that private currencies have a very impressive track record. I think I've established everything that Hayek said was right. Now, I do believe that private money would work even better if the governments didn't try to hamper it, putting people in jail for minting their own things and so forth. And they're still doing this. So the key insight is not that Hayek's idea is some speculative thing that we have no idea what it would look like. We do know what it would look like. It would have helped if Hayek had referred more explicitly to Vera Smith's work so that more recent economists were not misled. But the key insight for me is that Hayek invites us to rethink the state theory of money. This is the most important fundamental point. So the state theory of money is the atavistic doctrine that money is a creature of the state. We're saying it's a creature of the market. And we're saying it always was a creature of the market, but the state kept getting involved. So the state theory maintains that state-created money, that the state created money. This is wrong. Menger proves it's wrong. And that the government can do whatever it wants with it. Well, that is a sort of a moral position which I would bitterly oppose. So Hayek, I don't think we've learned anything since Hayek 1892, and that was adequate enough. Menger, 1892. The origin of money has everything to do with market forces. Barter giving away to cigarettes or gold or whatever. We see this in POW accounts and so on. The same forces giving rise to currency. Now, the state theory of money in its modern form goes to Georg Friedrich Knapp, whose book of the same name was published in 1905. And you could say that Knapp did to monetary economics what Marx did to economics in general. It utterly corrupted it. And it gets worse. His ideas spread far and wide, and perhaps wouldn't have spread that much, as wide as they did, but for the doings of his main English disciple, who was John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes was an ardent follower of Knapp in this regard. So in his treatise on money, Keynes says, the age of charterlist or state money was reached when the state claimed to declare what things should answer as money to the current unit of account. He said, when it claimed the right not only to enforce the dictionary, but to write the dictionary. He said, today all civilized money is beyond the possibility of dispute charterless. So that, to me, captures everything we're up against. I positively loathed that passage. Every time I read it, it makes my blood pressure go up. But this is what we're up against. We have the state theory of money, which so many economists buy into, and we have the market theory of money, and they're incompatible, and we have to choose. So we need to replace the state theory of money with the market theory of money. The market theory gives us a sound understanding of our monetary problems and of the solution to them. Now, this task is of the utmost importance and is a crucial part of any pro-free market reform movement. As Hayek says in his Denationalisation book, what we need now is a free money movement comparable to the free trade movement of the 19th century. And on the off chance, as I say, that our political constellations shine on us one day, and we have the opportunity to implement something like this, we should be ready. We should be able to dust down the book, implement free banking or a currency board if you wish, or something. If we can't do that, we should recommoditize the currency. So, should we ever get lucky and have a Javier Milei appear among us, we need to be able to give him clear advice on what he should do. And on a personal level, it would be great if we could grow the modern free banking movement to the point where those of us in it could take the risk of flying together, lest a plane crash wipe us all out. Okay. And thank you all for listening.